QuickBooks Pro Plus Desktop 2022 Preferences. Get ready because we bookkeeping pros are moving up the hilltop with QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2022. In a prior presentation, we got the QuickBooks program up and running, indicated by this icon here. We also set up the free sample file that comes with the QuickBooks program. That data file looks like this on the right-hand side. Once those two things are set up, you can open it by either double-clicking on the data file or on the program itself. Typically, people will then open up the program as we will do here. The last file that we had open, that is typically what the QuickBooks software will go into automatically. However, due to this being a sample file, it will still take us to this intro screen, and we'll have this one extra step of going into the sample file here and just opening that one up. It's going to then indicate that we are indeed going into a sample file. With this warning here, something that will not be on the file once we set up the practice files, as we will do later on in the course. The next thing that we're going to talk about, which is a common starting point a lot of times when you go into a QuickBooks type course, when you look at it from start to finish, is to go through the preferences. When we think about the preferences, there's going to be a whole lot of preferences. And so we just want to give an overview of them now, and then we'll go into them in much more detail, each of the preferences, in a future presentation. We will do so, in essence, the second half of the course when we get into starting a new company file from scratch, that being because many of the preferences are going to be needed to put together as you start a new company file. So in other words, if you go into a business type setting, oftentimes you're going to start with a company file that has already been set up, and you're generally going to use most of the preferences that have already been set up within the QuickBooks file. Those preferences, many of which are needed to be that way to facilitate the type of industry that you're working in, such as inventory preferences, for example, or if you have class tracking or job costing kind of setups that would be set up. And then there's some preferences that are just preferable in terms of your data, your personal preferences. So there's a whole lot of them. We'll go over them in future presentations, but just take a look at a recap at this point. So notice when we open this up, like always, we got the home page that typically opens up. The last items that we had open last time will still be open. I typically will close them out so that I don't have like a ton of windows open. And then I'm going to see I have this blank screen here. Then I'll typically open the view page, view dropdown, open windows, so we can see the open windows on this side. So here we just want to look at the preferences. So if we hit the dropdown on the view dropdown, the edit dropdown, we go all the way to the bottom. Here are all the preferences. I'll just list them right now, the categories on the left-hand side, and talk a little bit about them. And then in the second half of the course, when we start the new company file, we'll talk about them in more detail. So up top on the categories, we got the accounting preferences. You will typically have these two tabs, the My Preferences and the Company Preferences. Sometimes the My Preferences won't have anything there, and vice versa. So we got the Company Preferences. These are your usage of account numbers and some of the account settings, class tracking, and so on. We've got the bills, which is going to be part of your accounts payable type of setups, your calendar over here in terms of the references for it, the checking information having to do with your major checking accounts and the preferences related to them, the desktop views, finance charges, the general settings, including decimals and minutes on how you're going to categorize the time, and then some of the general settings on how things are going to be set up, which we'll take a look at in more detail in the second half of the course. Integrated applications, if you have application integration that would be applicable. Items and inventory. This one's going to be important if you sell inventory. You got to make sure that this will be set up if you want to track the inventory in QuickBooks, which we'll talk about in the second half of the course in more detail. Jobs and estimates. This would be something of like you have a job cost type of system and are sending out jobs and estimates. If you have a work in process type of system, completed contract type of system, or percentage of completion. Multiple currencies. So if you're doing business with other areas that have different currencies and you're going to be receiving or paying in other currencies and want to deal with the exchange rates and the accounting related to it. Payments tabs goes over, of course, payment preferences. payrolls and employees. So if you have payroll set up, these become more important and you got to set up your payroll preferences. The reminders, these give us a nice summary of some of the bells and stuff that will go on and give us some types of reminders. Some of these aren't as applicable when you do an example problem because we're in an example problem and the timing differences means that the reminders might not be as useful for us or could be a distraction, but we'll go over those later as well. Reports and graphs, we got the preferences for the reports and graphs. Sales and customers, which relates to the sales cycle. We have the sales tax, which will be important because the sales tax could be changing. In the U.S., it will be different based on the states because that's not a federal tax. So it's important to set up the proper sales tax if it be applicable to you. The search, we got the send forms, save connection, spelling, tax, the 1099. So you could set up your 1099 tracking information to see who you're going to be sending a 1099 to, time and expense information. So those are the general preferences. You can go through here and take a look at them in more depth or possibly make some changes that you think might be applicable to you, possibly in say the general tab might have some personal preferences you can look at, but we will go into them in more detail in the second half of the course when we start a new company file. Like I say, many of these preferences being useful for the first and primary setup of the company file to have it working properly going forward. So if you want to jump forward, if you're interested in particular preferences and you want to take a look at that section to get more detail on some of these categories, then you could do that.